everyone. Welcome. Good to see you all today. It's looking like a good turnout, which is great for our first session. Can you all hear me? Give me a thumbs up as long as you can hear me. Okay, good. Okay, so welcome to Legal Research, our first workshop together. I'm going to cover a couple of housekeeping things first. So I'm sure you're all aware, with the whole world having to do stuff via Zoom, occasionally Zoom might crash. So if I get kicked out of the meeting, please allow me about 10 to 15 minutes to get back in and see if I come back into the meeting. If after 15 minutes I haven't been able to get back in, you can assume it's cancelled, and I'll do a recording and post that on Moodle instead. Hopefully that won't happen, cross fingers, but just in case, just because of the amount of traffic that's going through Zoom. Also, thank you for those of you who have got your video on. It's great to have that feedback, little nods or thumbs up or whatever whenever I ask a question. So if possible, please put it on. But if you want to keep it off, that's also fine as well. And use the chat box if you'd rather not use your mic. In terms of ways to communicate other than the forums, as you guys probably know, I've set up an MS Teams site. That's a new thing for CQU that we've been trialing it for the last 6 months across a range of units. We're still trialing it. This is a trial process for legal research. So at the end of the unit, we'd really appreciate your feedback on how that worked for you and whether it's a good way of communicating with your peers and posting ideas and discussions. I was going to set up a Facebook page actually until I found out that we could be included in the trial. So if anybody would prefer a Facebook page, can you post that in the chat? But at the moment, I was going to stick to just 2 places where you can communicate: the forums in Moodle and MS Teams. The great thing about Teams is that I can create study groups for you guys. So if you find a group of people who are working on a similar topic to you and you want to share some resources and ideas, then we can create a little group for you within Teams, and you can then use that to video call each other or message each other like you would in Facebook Messenger. So it's got all of that usability. The good thing about the video call function in MS Teams is that it's not as loaded as Zoom with traffic, so it's generally a bit better in terms of quality. Other things to talk about. So let me know if you'd like a study group, and who the participants are, and then I can create that in Teams for you. You might be able to do it yourself, but I know that I can definitely do that for you. In terms of textbook, I've found out from the library that there are only 3 hard copies available, and we've got 160 students in this unit. So I've complained about that, and they're looking into whether or not they can get access to an electronic copy from Lexis. So hopefully I'll get some information on that, and I'll let you know on the forums as soon as possible what the outcome of that is. Please note that there are older editions in the library, but they're going to be really out of date because unfortunately Lexis and Westlaw regularly completely overhaul their platforms. And so it makes any of the information contained in those older textbooks obsolete. The same actually with the Federal Register of Legislation. That went over an overhaul about 4 or 5 years ago. So don't bother with those older versions. You can probably survive without the textbook because I've provided a lot of videos, both my own videos and videos from Lexis and Westlaw, on how to use their sites, so you won't necessarily need the textbook. But what the textbook is good at is teaching you how to do keyword searches and think about methodology of research and things like that. Now, just before we move on to talking about the research topic, is there anybody who wants to go through the assessment, or are you all good because I talked about it in the first video? All good? Okay, if anything occurs to you, just stick it in the chat and I'll deal with it. Okay, so topics for the research project. So the reason I picked this one, because we always try and link it to a law reform commission, project is, I picked this one because I think it's a really hot topic. It's a current topic, and it's a topic that impacts all of us in some way, because we're talking about things as simple as the use of our mobile phones, what we use it for, how we use it, who we communicate with, whether or not we can share information with each other. It's as broad as that. So I thought that that would be a really interesting, you could find some connection to it that would engage you, because at the end of the day, doing one topic for 12 weeks is hard work. So we've got to find something that interests us. And I think that hopefully you can find your niche within that. It might take some time. So don't be worried if today you don't know what you're going to do it on yet. Just read around for a bit and wait until you find something that you like the look of. But just to show you just some of the sort of current discussions that are ongoing, or discussions that have been quite significant in the media recently, I just thought I'd share some things that I've found with you just to get you thinking about this. So let's just grab that. Okay, so I'll just close this window. Okay, so hopefully what you can see is the global biometric facial recognition market is to top 12 billion by 2026 on public security and retail growth. So this article, which is a news article on the biometricupdate.com, talks about the fact that this is probably the fastest growing technology right now. Some people talk about us being in the fourth industrial revolution, and what they mean by that is we're now linking biology with technology. So we don't just have things like technology assisted movement of arms and limbs and things like that, but we're implanting chips in our bodies. There's thoughts that we might end up with control panels at the bottom of our brains. So there's lots of space for bio and tech to combine. So that's one thing that we can see there. And then I've just got to move this out of the way. Recently, well, this is in the last year, Perth Council decided to include CCTV with facial recognition software in it. And that's a really interesting move on their part, because you kind of question what's the necessity of facial recognition software for a council. Maybe for police and police enforcement, you know, at a stadium or a football or a concert event where they might be looking for, say, terror suspects or someone who's likely to cause violence and that kind of stuff. But why would the council need facial recognition technology? So that's a really interesting area, because there's a sort of ethical or moral issue there of community concern. And then this one here is data tracking. So of course you guys will have seen all the discussion about the COVID-19 app, and it is supposed to, although they now question whether or not it's actually very effective, but that it's supposed to track where you've been and then push that information to the relevant government department in the event that you have been in contact with someone who has had COVID-19 or has been diagnosed with it, should I say. So, but this is just one aspect of the data tracking availability, right? This is just a tip of the iceberg scenario. You guys probably have got Find My Phone on your iPhone or the Android equivalent, but there's also secret apps and software that can be installed across a range of devices, not just phones, but laptops. And then you can, of course, get tracking devices that you can attach to cars and also put in people's pockets and things like that. And so the question is, how do this is an emerging area because of the fact that it's connected to GPS and phones, and therefore we're going to see this aspect grow quite quickly. But it's been in existence for a long time. People have been using tracking devices, private detectives, and people who want to control other people. We've seen it in a domestic violence context. People might use tracking devices. So this is an expansion of that zone into mobile technology. And so this is just an example of how it is now being used in a variety of ways, not just private detectives and perhaps in family court or legal disputes, but it's also being used in domestic violence contexts, so covert tracking. And then finally, this is something that I thought was quite interesting. So if any of you got Alexa or the Google Mini, or even Siri and then the Android equivalent on your phones, they eavesdrop on your conversations. So this article here discusses how when Alexa is triggered, it's a false alarm and you didn't actually want Alexa to do anything, it records information and then sends it back to the Amazon IT team, who then use that false alert to train the AI to respond better. So quite often it will obviously record harmless stuff such as background information, but it also means that there are people and AI technology that are listening to your conversations even when you don't want that software to be involved in your conversation. So I'll just stop sharing now. So I mean, I've got a Google Mini and I knew that it was doing that. And I don't know about you guys, but every time that I look at something on my phone or I ask my phone to do something for me, I then get lots of ads on Facebook and all the other stuff that match that thing. So when I say, you know, oh, call this shop for this, and then all of a sudden I get adverts for that item. So, you know, it's listening to us all the time, but of course that's actually invading into our private space. So there's that aspect to it as well. So really some really interesting topics. You guys need to decide how you're going to narrow this down, because you couldn't do what the Queensland Law Reform Commission has done. Okay, you can't cover everything. You've only got a small amount of words, and you need to also bear in mind that you can't read all the resources that have come out you know, on that topic over the last 5-10 years. So you need to narrow it down, and so that's got to be your priority for the next week or two. What have we got in the comments? Hang on just a second. I used to work in the City of Perth CCTV room, state of the art back then. They assist the police a lot with the tracking movements of suspects. That's absolutely, you know, an exclusion of the Queensland Law Reform Commission is law enforcement. And it's really important that you keep your project within the confinement of the Law Reform Commission's review. So workplace surveillance and police is excluded. And I guess that would be that balance between preventing crime and public interest in identifying those suspects and the invasion of our privacy in a public space. So yeah, I mean, there might not be any issue with that, but Perth was the first one to do that. According to that article, it was the first council to go beyond just CCTV recording. In fact, most of the CCTV recording in city centres doesn't even have audio. It's really just the visual element. So to go to facial recognition was a big step. And then we've got, I noticed a lot of people were posting their mind maps and whatnot on Moodle. Participation is not essential for the grade. No, it's not. So the research portfolio is your collection of the work that you have done for the workshops. When you do those workshops is up to you, as long as you get them in before week 13. Okay. But actually posting it on Moodle and that back and forth chat is not part of the assessment. The only time that we really require you to engage as part of the assessment is within one of those workshop activities where you need at the very end to swap your draft with a peer for a little bit of feedback to help each other. But that's just the 1 week. And again, you don't have to do it in a public place like MS Teams or the forum. You can just do it between you via email. Okay, it's really more that I just want to see that you've gone through that process and what feedback you gave, what feedback you received, and that's incorporated into your portfolio. Now, how you want to do your portfolio is up to you. You can do it as a Word document or a PowerPoint presentation, or you can do it using Adobe software. There's quite a lot of interesting stuff out there, the creative Adobe software. But yeah, or however you want to do it, it's fine. It's really just your reflection on your work and your overall work that you've prepared. And every workshop is geared towards helping you with your final project as well. So there's some aspect of it that is designed to either help you with your project plan or the final project. So we're actually it's just part of the process of preparing your final project. So I hope you won't find it too onerous. Okay, so let's now, I thought we'd just have a poll to see where some of you are at. So this one is, how many of you have found a topic that you're interested in, with 4 different options? It's anonymous. I was just wondering where everyone's at. Just waiting for a few more. Okay, so let me share the results with you. You should be able to see that nobody knows exactly what they're doing yet. That's all fine. That's all good. Some of you have got a rough idea, about 34% of you. 22% are still deciding, and 44% have no idea whatsoever. So large proportion of you don't have any idea whatsoever. So I hope that what we're about to do in a second might help you think about narrowing it down. One of the best places to start, one of the best places to start is perhaps by making sure you thoroughly read the issues paper, because it really does, it takes it step by step for the relevant technologies and the contexts in which they are used, so that and it gives you some resources as well. Like, there's quite a lot of citation in there of different cases and legislation and all sorts, so it gives you a starting point for thinking about those issues. And I would suggest going through that and highlighting the stuff that interests you, crossing through what you're not bothered about, and that will help you start to find your topic. So a couple of people have said, I'm really glad that we're in the same boat. You're all in it together, okay? All right, so I've got some brief PowerPoints just to help you think about how to narrow your topic down. And I want to start with this one. Okay, so so here, these are in essence a summary of the technologies that are included in the issues paper. So you can see that there's mention of drones, and that's problematic because of the massive expansion of drones on the retail market. You know, you can buy them on Kogan and JB Hi-Fi, and most of them don't just take pictures, they also record video. So there's a potential there for, obviously, invasion into privacy of people in their own backyards, for example. So that's one area of concern that was noted. The other was tracking apps and devices, as I've already said. Some of them are used in terms of private investigation, so not in your criminal setting, but in private investigation. Some of them are used covertly for criminal purposes, harassing and stalking victims, for pursuing domestic violence objectives, etc. Then there's audio recording apps and devices. Obviously, most of us on our phones have the ability to record audio via the memo function or something equivalent, but there's also a range of devices that are covert as well, so bugging people's houses, and also phone tapping as well, so managing to record people's private telephone conversations. Then we've got visual recordings via apps and devices. Again, it can there are apps and software that can turn your camera against you, so it can actually record what you're doing without you being aware of it. Some people actually put stickers over their cameras on their laptops when they're not using them, just to make sure in case they get hacked. But there's also a range of devices. Again, some of them can be used covertly. You will have seen it used thousands of times in movies, you know, Mission Impossible and all that kind of stuff, where they've got tiny little pin cameras that they use. And of course, some people can get hold of those and use those for other purposes than law enforcement. Then we've got data surveillance. So our phones produce vast volumes of data. There's data collected about us everywhere we go, and that can be misused, as we saw with the Facebook Cambridge Analytica scandal, and there's a range of other instances. For example, I know that Google and Google is now sharing, and I think Facebook as well, but I'd have to check that. Google is now sharing data that it's collected with authorities to help with identifying tracing for COVID. So if you've been using Google Maps, if you've got GPS enacted on your phone and it's connected to Google, then it will provide them with information. Now, at this stage, I don't think it's individual information. It's more general data to help them understand population movement. But again, that's another way of how a resource that we use on our phone, like GPS, is then converted to a different use in a different context. And finally, we've got biometric data. So as we discussed in that few news clippings I got, facial recognition is becoming a massive industry. It's already being used in China, even for things like accessing the internet, and paying for items is the next thing that it will be expanded into in China. So it all feels very much like the Minority Report, if you've seen that. Okay, so the next thing we've got is other ways to narrow down your topic. So rather than looking at the type of technology, you could think about whether you're going to focus on a particular context. So there's a difference between overt and covert surveillance. So for example, there is CCTV. If I've got CCTV on the outside of my house, you know that I am watching you. Now, I'm probably recording my driveway and my garden, not you as such, unless you walk up my driveway. But when you walk up my driveway, you know you're being recorded because you can see it. But covert surveillance, usually the person being observed has no knowledge that they are being observed, whether that's via audio, visual, or both. So you could distinguish between those two contexts, or you could focus on privacy or surveillance that occurs in a public or private space. So you could just focus on public surveillance and not look at private spaces, or instead you could look at our privacy within our own homes and what the limitations of that are, and especially with the technology as it's growing rapidly. The other approach that you could adopt is to focus on how this emerging technology interacts with other areas of the law. So we've got a patchwork of coverage at the moment. We've got defamation and obligations of confidentiality and inequity, criminal law for harassment, domestic violence. So the use of those technologies for those purposes would be a crime. We've got trespass. People are not supposed to trespass on your property, which means they can't install listening devices in your premises without your consent. They can't enter your premises without your consent. And then we've got human rights issues. So you could look at what protection and gaps there are by looking at how this myriad of different areas of the law protect our privacy or in fact don't. The alternative is to be even more theoretical and look at the conflict between competing interests and competing rights. So you could look at things such as national security interests and freedom of speech as two competing interests. You could look at the public interest in knowing certain information. So for example, some of those covert technologies and have been used by journalists in the past to obtain information that they wouldn't have necessarily been able to access. Now, that's been misused on a number of occasions. I'm sure you know that in the UK, there was a phone tapping scandal where celebrities and I think Prince William their phones were tapped for information that would be tabloid news. It wouldn't, it was of general interest for a range of papers, but not for political journalism. So there's that aspect that you could take there, or you could just look at the current levels of regulation on a particular technology and look for overlaps and gaps, which could include a jurisdictional analysis. So you could talk about the differences across a number of jurisdictions and what that means for someone who is perhaps affected in one state, but the perpetrator is in another state. So for example, you have someone who arranges for a phone tapping in WA or even abroad in another country, but the damage, the record of the conversation occurs within, say, Queensland. And finally, you could also focus on the use of the technology and the information that is obtained through that technology. So one of the things that we see is what's known as function creep, which is where data is collected for one purpose, but then used for another purpose. So that information is either sold on or communicated to other entities or people without our consent. So you've got initial consent to the gathering of the data, but then it is used in ways that you didn't necessarily envisage. Or you could focus on not the way that the technology gathers the information. Instead, you could focus on the communication or publication of that information. And you could also look, or alternatively look at its use in civil and criminal proceedings, because there will be admissibility issues with gathering things like visual recordings and data via tracking apps and things like that. Alternatively, you might want to step away from that environment and think about if we're focusing on controlling how this technology is used, do we need to extend that to the manufacture and sale of this software and devices? And you could look at the regulatory aspect from the perspective of the manufacture and sale, rather than focused on the person that uses the device or the app. One other aspect that pops up in the Law Reform Commission's issue paper is what redress should there be for breach? So obviously if someone uses it for, say, domestic violence purposes, for tracking their victim, then you've got a criminal sanction. But what about where our privacy is invaded and it's not a crime? In what instance should we have breach? What should that look like? And do we need a regulator to enforce the new rules that are going to come out of this issues paper? So there's a whole, you don't need to put something from each of those PowerPoints together to make your project. Your project in itself is probably only going to focus on one or two things in total across all three slides, because otherwise it's going to be too wide and you're going to get overwhelmed with information. So anybody got any comments or questions about what I just showed you, or maybe even just some thoughts that you've been having about any of those things that I've mentioned?
Excuse me, Nicola.
Yes, hi.
How are you?
Good, thanks.
I just had a quick question about the function creep that you were just, because I've read a little bit about where people send their DNA in to get genotyping and to get family trees and that sort of thing. And I don't know, like I'm wondering if some of that gets on-sold I've been reading a little bit about how some of that information can get on-sold to companies, and it says anonymously, but your DNA is still out there, and for research into, you know, certain things and medical and all that sort of thing. So is that what you were thinking about there with the function creep? Is that the same sort of thing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, clearly I was thinking more in terms of Facebook. You know, we consent to putting our images up there, although we try and limit our privacy, but companies data scrape across Facebook for information. And in fact, one of the most recent technologies has, in the facial profiling software, goes across everything that it can find on Facebook to help the profiling. So it doesn't just go to your police databases. It goes to all of your public information on Facebook and Google and all of that. So it's not just searching across a criminal database, it's searching across every database. So wherever my face appears, I can now be in facial recognition software. But that's what I was thinking about. But it's a really good point that you raised there, because I actually saw a TV program about DNA profiling the other day, just randomly. It was actually a chat show type discussion. But many of them have privacy. So those companies that you send it off to have privacy policies. And they're required usually to have privacy policies if they're going to operate in Australia, because that's what we require under the Office of Information and Privacy, etc. So They're required to have privacy policies, but if you look very carefully at them, they tell you what they will use it for. And so quite often they say, we will never use it for the following purposes. Some of them, and there's a variation as to how far they'll go. Some of them will on-sell or provide it to third parties, but it will be anonymous when they provide that information. Others won't use it at all. But the problem is, of course, that all of them say there's no issue with privacy with us because you can always withdraw your consent. And if you withdraw your consent, we will take down the data. But of course, that doesn't stop the fact that that information has already been used. So, and the information has already been out there on the web. And one of the ways that that has been used in the US is to track criminal suspects. So
yeah, that's what I heard it on. That's how they caught that really famous killer.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So they were able to narrow down the family tree of likely suspects. So through basically scraping those DNA websites where that information is public. Now, law enforcement again is outside the scope of the project, but there's a broader issue there of, well, when you consent, you can't withdraw your consent. There are consequences to this information, and maybe we need to, if you have a regulator, how should that regulator control these kinds of websites where they're gathering information, perhaps with initial consent, but then what they're doing with that information and what the public is doing with that information. So yeah, you could do something in that space, definitely.
Thank you.
Okay, what else have we got? The video you mentioned at the start discussing the assignment, I can't seem to find it. In the week 1 video, I outlined the 3 assessments in this unit. So have a look at that. It's probably, in the first half of the video, I talk about the assessment there. But if you've got any more questions, Nicole, just send them through. And then we've got TikTok is a good example of that. A good example of what, Clinton?
Just the on-selling or the moving, you're providing information from that and they're collecting the underlying data, a whole heap of data underneath what they're actually designed for.
Yeah.
So you're publishing stuff and that your information is then getting on-sold to host nation countries and other countries of interest.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, Facebook are, they're conducting psychological experiments with us with some of that data. So they work out, things like how effective are likes and emoticons at getting people to do things, and how effective are their adverts. So they're constantly gathering information about adverts so that they can make their adverts more effective and generate more money. So it's all money focused.
And even
sorry, go on.
Sorry, even to say that what they consider their community standards are. So they're a private enterprise, so they're applying their own broad brush sort of their take on a community standard. So they're potentially censoring information, or what they're dictating what could be out in the mainstream.
Absolutely. And again, I think you can, in many cases, make complaints to the Information Commissioner, but what jurisdiction do they have over Facebook when Facebook is not present in Australia? So its registered address is Ireland. It's got a place of business in the US. So there are jurisdictional issues with worldwide technology. Okay. Okay, Chan. Hi, Nicola. When ready, could you please provide an example of how a statement of your research topic could be worded? That is for next week. So we will talk about the kind of language that you might want to use in framing a research question or a research topic. For now, I just want you guys to just hone in on what are the key things I'm going to look at. Don't want you to be trying to formulate a question. It's putting too much pressure on yourself when you don't actually know that much about the topic. You need to actually obtain an understanding of the topic to then be able to see where the gaps are or where the areas of interest are that you then want to focus on. So now just be focusing on, are you looking at technology? Are you looking at context? Are you looking at use of the information that's gathered? And try and narrow it down that way. And then Google Analytics, yes, that's true as well. So Google Analytics collects lots of information. Even my YouTube videos collects information. I got a thumbs down today as well as some thumbs up, by the way. If any of you don't like the videos and you need more information, please let me know and I'll do an extra video. So yeah, we get Google Analytics. It tells me how many people have watched the video, how many people, how long people stayed on it as well, like what was the average duration that you watched it, all of that kind of information. I don't want that information, it just gives it me for free. And what else have we got? Cat, the issue of minors and technology. So do minors have capacity to provide consent where under laws they are not of the age to, or should parents provide that where the legislation, and where does the legislation regulate minors? Well, that's an interesting thing in the criminal setting, because the new legislation on sharing of intimate images, so images of people either naked or in their underwear, children cannot consent to that at all. So it's an offense now to share an image of someone naked, for example. This all stems from revenge porn pictures and things like that. So it's now an offense to share an image of a naked person without that person's consent, the person that's in the picture. And it's implied that children can't consent because they're not actually dealt with in the legislation. So you could take that angle and then say, well, how does this translate to the civil sphere, and look at the consent of minors to the collection of data. Interesting areas that you could also look at that have occurred in the press over time recently. The use of covert recording in homes. So things like old people's homes and care homes, they have used small pinhole cameras to record abuse that was happening to elderly patients in those settings. And also, I think some parents have been using cameras in teddy bears and things like that to watch people who care for their children, to ensure that they are not behaving inappropriately towards their children when the parents are not in the house. So that's an example of covert recording. And each jurisdiction's a little bit different in the way that it deals with that. So that would be an interesting topic when you're looking at members of the public. So this is not law enforcement, this is members of the public deciding that there's a safety issue or a child protection issue, and so they go and use covert means to obtain information about what's really going on. What else have we got? Children and technology is a broad topic, but it's also a concern with social media and criminality. Absolutely, but you must keep it out of that criminal zone just because it's not the focus of the Law Reform Commission. And also I think that could be quite unwieldy. Okay, as Lachlan, so as it should have been for many years, how that was ever not a criminal thing is beyond me. What are you talking about there, Lachlan?
I was talking about taking revenge porn and that whole thing. I think it's abhorrent that it was ever, I mean, I understand that there weren't laws about it in particular at some point in time, but I still think that there should have been, you know, something that covers it as a criminal offense. Like, it always should have been prosecutable to some extent through some kind of backdoor thing, regardless of whether or not there was legislation about it.
Yeah, absolutely.
I just think that we've taken too much time to put that in place.
Well, I mean, that's in Queensland, and each jurisdiction's still different. So you've got to bear that in mind. But what's interesting about that is it comes mainly from that revenge porn thing, as I was talking about, but it also is connected to bullying too. And that is a topic that you could think about and look about, is how are these technologies used for bullying purposes in the school setting, and what regulation do we really have apart from the criminal law, which is obviously looking at harassment and things like that, you know, a form of stalking. What do we have that can protect in those instances, and how do you regulate something like Facebook? I mean, it's really quite tricky. So with that in mind, so we've bounced some ideas around. Anyone else got anything they want to talk about that's on their mind right now as topic areas? No? Okay. All right. Well, I'm just going to ask a poll just for those of you that are thinking about focusing on technology. So you don't all need to answer this. But if you are thinking about technology, I'm interested in how the split is across the unit, across the enrollments, as to what area you're thinking about looking at.
I recently purchased a drone, so I had to learn a lot about it in a very short amount of time for the legalities of things. So I found that was the first thing I jumped on.
Fair enough, fair enough. I think drones is perhaps a more obvious choice because it's already been through. In 2014, there was a federal report prepared on it because, of course, it's got aviation safety issues. But that doesn't mean that they really considered it beyond that context of how it could be used in 2014. And, of course, the technology's come on quite some way since then. I mean, we've now got drones being used to deliver packages for Amazon, so it's completely different technology. Okay, so about 70% of you have voted, so a few more. And of course, drones are used not just in for recreational purposes, but government agencies use them for things like assessing what the fishing stocks are like, or managing our tropical waters and things like that. Farmers use them for identifying cattle. So there's a whole range of uses beyond the police and private home user just messing around with one in their back garden. Okay, so I might close that poll now and I'll share with you the data. Okay, so you can see that about 27% of you are interested in biometric data, and of course that isn't just facial recognition, it's things like thumbprints being used for payment, to access phones and things like that. And moving forward in the future, it might even be looking at things like chips in hands to pay for things and all of those kind of stuff. About 10% of you are looking at drones, 23% looking at tracking apps and devices, 17% looking at data surveillance, 17% thinking about listening apps and devices, which is one of the older technologies, and then about 37% thinking about visual recording. 3% is other. Okay, so quite a broad mix. As I say to you, if you focus on those areas and you want to be in touch with like-minded people, let me know because I can facilitate that on Microsoft Teams. Okay, so what I would like to do now is get onto the workshop activity. So is anyone willing to share with us their mind map? We've seen some of them on the forum, so hopefully you're not too shy. Anyone want to volunteer? There's no right or wrong version of a mind map. I should say that straight away. It's really your impression of the information that you've gathered so far, what agencies are involved, what who might have a strong opinion or be impacted significantly by the change in the law. So anyone want to share? Eloise says she's happy to. Can you see a share screen button at the bottom? Let me just facilitate that. Hang on, multiple participants can share. Can you see that? If so, you can load your document on your screen and then you just select it, or you could just pop it into the chat and I will load it for you instead.
Sure, just 5 minutes and I'll just put it in there.
No worries, thank you. While she's doing that, I might actually show you another way of visualizing it. So rather than it being a mind map, this is a very basic document, but you could also do it like this. So you could do it as a graph with, and it doesn't matter which goes on which axis, but you have levels of power in this instance on the left hand side, and so the higher up it goes, the more power or control they have, and then on the bottom you can see level of impact. So in that instance, the further away it goes, again, the more impact it has on them. So you could say, for example, that up here somewhere, and it would actually be over here, is the, so I hope you can all see the cursor, over here somewhere would be the Civil Aviation Standards Authority in relation to drones, because they will have a lot of control and power because they're regulating air safety. They're also going to have a pretty big opinion on how that area should be regulated, and any change in the law will impact how they regulate that area. So they would be here in the graph. But then you might get individual members of the community who have a significant opinion, but they have no control. So their control is here, but they've got a big opinion about what should happen. Or you might get not-for-profit organizations or advocacy groups that don't have any control when it comes to the government, so or when it comes to legislative change. So they're going to be down here on that axis, but they've got lots of opinion or impact. So they would be down here. So plotting it like that can help you visualize who the big players are. Does that make sense? That's another way of viewing your mind maps. Now, what I would advise is that whatever your mind map looks like, that you keep updating it regularly, just so that if you take time away from your project, which you probably will, because you'll have other assessments for other units and you might get stuck for a week where you don't do anything, it will help you get back on track. But you need to update it, because otherwise it won't be a fresh example of where you were last at. So if you decided, say, to focus on drones, update it so that it reflects that rather than every aspect of the Queensland Law Reform Commission's report. And then that will help you. You can start to note, if you wanted to, the relevant legislation or the relevant information that you're finding against those relevant entities. So when you're looking at legislation that governs, again, just as an example, drones, then you might note that the regulator is the CASA, and you might note next to their name what legislation that is. Okay, so here we've got an example of a mind map, which is really great, and we can see that we've got influence, power, and control on one side there, significant interest or opinion on the left, and then impacted or affected at the bottom. So one of the things I think that we often forget, which is here, is things like other countries and the United Nations. So that's a good thing. That's a good thing to think about, and go and see whether you can find any information on that, or are there any international organizations that might have input on this. You could also note there, they won't have influence or power and control, but we might be able to find something useful from other jurisdictions outside of Australia, as well as within Australia. What else have we got here? Yeah, so technology users, that's a really interesting point there on the mind map as well, that technology users and victims of crime and business owners might all have different points of view, but they are all impacted differently. So their points of view are usually affected by the impact it has on them. Okay, so the greater the potential for impact, usually the more opinion they have, or the stronger the opinion they have. And then those with significant interest or opinion, I like the fact that you've put terrorist groups and hackers there, but I'm not sure that they would necessarily voice their opinion that strongly in a submission to the Queensland Law Reform Commission. Although I'm sure that they could always hack as a protest, maybe, the Queensland Law Reform Commission's website. But yes, third parties who buy information is a really good one, because we're talking there about that whole data scraping, whether or not our e-health records with Medicare are sold on for data collection purposes. Who are they sold to? Are they sold to big data companies and advertisers, or are they sold to medical research organizations, or where are they sold to insurers? Do they help insurers calculate risk, All of that is really interesting information. And then what else have we got there? Manufacturers of equipment and technology. So that was what I was saying earlier. You could actually just spin it, and rather than focusing on the use, the collection and use of the information, you could actually focus on regulating the industry at the top end, which is where this software and technology comes from. Okay, thanks for that. If you wouldn't mind stopping sharing that for a little bit. Brilliant, thank you. So that was a really great example of a mind map, and it's definitely it's definitely something that you guys need to have as a work in progress. You don't see it as a final product. And the more that you fill it out now, the easier it's going to be for you to put things together when it comes to working out the structure of your project, because it's going to help you think, oh, hang on, there was another interested party here that I should have a paragraph on them. Or it might help you go, actually, someone else has an alternative opinion that contradicts this. I need to go and look at what they say. So it's actually just there to help you start to formulate a structure. That means, of course, that you do need to tailor it to the area of interest that you decide on. Okay, thank you so much for that, Eloise. That was really, really great of you to do that. Now, there are some other examples on the forum, so you might want to go back and on the forum and in the week 1 chat in Microsoft Teams, there's a couple of different ones. You might want to go back and have a look, provide some feedback, share some ideas. If you find one that's on a topic that's similar to yours as well, it might be a good idea to start chatting to that person about some ideas for your research project. Okay, so that is pretty much what I wanted to do. Does anyone else want to share their mind map and talk us through what they decided to do and why? No. No, that's fine. That's fair enough. Okay, well, next week we're going to be talking about trying again to narrow down your topic, but also thinking about how we frame it. What angle do we take on it? So there's a difference between taking a sort of neutral approach and weighing up the pros and the cons and then eventually reaching a conclusion, to taking a particular stand. So you can take a particular stand and say, I'm going to take a human rights perspective here. The right to privacy is paramount, and here's what I'm going to argue. The language that you would use in framing those two topics would be different. Okay, so one would involve an evaluation or an analysis, a critical analysis of the law, and the other might use language such as why the law should be X. Okay, because that's a one stance perspective. So that's one of the things that we're going to look at next week. What that means, though, is that you do need to spend a bit of time, and hopefully you've got the time at the moment because you haven't got any other assessments going on. Spend a bit of time over the next week going through the paper and really starting to think about which one you're going to focus on, and thinking about how you might start collecting the sources that you need for that. Now, if you need help with your ability to locate legislation or cases, look at week 4 and 5. There is a page in there, a link in Moodle to a range of videos for each of the databases. So if you feel you need to brush up on your skills in any of those areas, you should be able to find a video that will provide you with that. If it's just, say, Lexis and you're good at Westlaw, then just focus on the Lexis stuff. And then in week 6, we look at secondary sources. Now that's a bit more tricky because we've got so many databases on the library website, we can't really cover videos for all of those. So instead, the video, introductory video for that week talks about search terms and how to use things like double quotation marks and truncation and stuff like that. Now, Kat says, how do we present the research project? I realize the reflection is either a Word or PowerPoint. It doesn't, so the research portfolio doesn't have to be just Word or PowerPoint. It could be, there's some really interesting Adobe software that you can use and all sorts. You present that however you want to. As long as you've done, it shows me that you've done the work for each week. That's great. In terms of the research project, it does need to be either a Word document or a PDF. It needs to be written, it's 2,500 words, and it needs to be fully cited in accordance with the AGLC, so AGLC 4. Have a look at a couple of the examples from 2018, which are on the Moodle site. I don't have the 2019 ones because I didn't teach it and I don't have access for some reason to that unit. So I've had to roll with the 2018 ones. So you're going to treat it a little bit like a research essay that you've probably done in the past, but you've got a lot more control over it because I'm not setting you a question. So you determine the title and you work out how you're going to address that. Now, it can be a title or it can be a question. You don't need to necessarily frame it as a question. But you need to work out how you're going to explore the issues and the structure within that. So really, my advice would be focus on the project plan for now, which is basically a summary of what you're going to look at and how you're going to go about doing it. And then start the writing process for the final project a little bit after that when you've had some feedback. For now, gathering your sources, focusing on the project plan, I think is perhaps the best option. Does that answer your question, Kat? All good? Okay. Any other questions from anyone across the floor?
Can I just so that we're either presenting it or we can actually put an argument for or against based on all the information.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's perfectly fine for you to say, I'm going to take a stance against overt recording in public of CCTV footage or whatever. But in that analysis, you can't just, so rather than doing a pros and cons, you would present a particular stance. But as part of that stance, the strongest argument is always the argument that not only says, I'm right about this, but also says, and this is why the other side is wrong. So it does still involve reference to the other side's argument. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. So it's just the way that you handle that information and reference to those sources on the other side, the way you handle it is different. But it still requires you to do the same research, even if it's pros and cons versus a stance. Does that make sense? Okay, good.
Thank you.
Any other questions? No? Okay, well, I think that's pretty much us on time. So it's been great for our first workshop. So great to see you all, and thanks for such a great turnout. And if there's any questions in the meantime, I always check MS Teams every day. I also check the forum every day, so feel free to post them there. It would be great to see you starting to brainstorm some ideas together. Nothing that you pick at this stage is definitive or definite. Allow yourself the flexibility to go down a different path. You don't have to make that decision until you're close to your project plan, okay? Really, it's now about exploring the areas and where you think you can get some good material, some good arguments, and an area that really engages you. So don't put too much pressure on yourself. Just read around and start to think about what the crucial issues are. Okay. All right, thank you, everybody. I wish you all a very pleasant evening, and I'll see you next week. Bye.